I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where we learn about music, filmmaking, and the other creative arts. To support this podcast, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Cho Bead. Quick shout out to my music endorsements: Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ballstrings Tune Track, and Millennia Media. Now let's get this episode beginned. I have two quick Carl King the Human updates, and then we will officially get beginned. Number one, yesterday, on Monday, I released a prog metal cover of Friday by Rebecca Black. Hey, remember that song? No? Well, I'll play a quick snippet of my version right now. Friday, burn it down on Friday. Okay, that's all you get. To hear the entire song, just head over to my BandCamp page. It's also coming to all streamers in the coming days or coming weeks. And that BandCamp link will be in the show notes. That's carlking.bandcamp.com. And number two, last week on YouTube, I released an instrumental-only mix of my 46-minute prog rock composition, Heroes Ship or Minimum of One Planet Must Explode in First Act. And that's from my album Grand Architects of the Universe. As fun as it is to listen to it with all of the sci-fi narration, you can now focus on the scales and finger exercises. So head over to my YouTube channel to give it a listening. That's youtube.com/Carl Kingdom. And now, let's move on to the song analysis of the week. This week, we're going to put on our music theory socks and analyze Moonpeople by Devin Townsend from his latest album, Lightwork. Now, if you don't know this one, go and give it a listening. I'll put a link in the description. And this is a simple, straightforward song. And catchy, too. I've got to say, the moment I heard it, I thought, dang, I like that. And it features what I think is his best asset, his voice. The song starts with just a single Devin, and by the end, we get a whole choir of Devins. Mr. Townsend works with a lot of the same basic compositional vocabulary that I do. We're both major chord oriented, or at least we gravitate towards using a lot of simple triads. Although Devin tends to overlay more occasional extensions like nines and 11s for added texture, and I almost never do. We both modulate a lot, and we both use the Lydian mode. He's also big on flat 6 scale degrees and augmented or whole tone sounds. And both of us will occasionally throw in some sort of bitonal, 2 superimposed major chords kind of thing. Now, let's talk about the specifics of Moonpeople. The song stays at 88 BPM all the way through and is in the 4/4 time signature. And it all starts out with a verse in B-flat major, which is a good choice of key, and it's perfect for accommodating jazzy improvisation. I have to point out that the first verse is actually 2 verses, or 1 verse repeated twice, so I'm going to call this first one verse 1A. The bass guitar is chunking along down there on a B-flat note, and Devin implies B-flat major with his vocal melody. He starts on the 5th scale degree, F, and walks down to 4, the E-flat, and 3, which is a D. He also throws in a 6th scale degree, which is a G. Now, those vocals are entirely diatonic to B-flat major. However, he reharmonizes the next phrase with a G G-flat major chord, singing the notes C and B-flat over it. Now, to refresh your memory, the notes in G-flat are G-flat, A-flat, B-flat, C-flat, D-flat, E-flat, and F. That's right, 6 flats. But Devin is singing the notes C and B-flat. And in the key of G-flat, that C would actually be a C-flat, but he raises it back to C natural. So that makes it a raised fourth. Okay, music theory nerds, what do you call a major scale with a raised fourth? That's right, Devin has temporarily modulated from B-flat major to G-flat Lydian. Also, the distance in the roots between B-flat major and G-flat major is a minor 6 up or a major third down. Thus, we have one of the classic sci-fi chord progressions, and it's also a chordal relationship that Devin has all over his music. 2 major chords, a major third apart. And by the way, that Lydian sharp 4 is something you'll hear everywhere in his songs. He's been doing that at least as far back as Ocean Machine and Heavy as a Really Heavy Thing. It's almost like he can't help hitting sharp 4s and flat 6s. Now, anyone else writing this song would probably just keep all the chords in B-flat major. That G-flat major could have instead been an E-flat major, and that would have been a 4 chord. And that would have fit the melody just fine. But Devin was clever to, early on in the song, throw in that little modulation and say, this is not a normal diatonic song, and I am going to mess with you. When working this song out, I noticed there's a strong melodic similarity here to the verse of U2's Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, when Bono sings, Only to Be With You. And another thing, the bass guitar stays on B-flat when they go to the G-flat major chord, which means that B-flat functions as the third of the G-flat major chord, creating a first inversion. So it's functioning as both a pedal tone creating tension, but it also works as the major third of the G-flat major chord, since the notes of a G-flat major are G-flat, B-flat, and D-flat. It's a nice move. If you keep the same bass note and just move the chords around on top, it's a great way of creating tension. It's a very John Williams thing. It can be a compositional trick to hold out that static bass note over a whole progression before finally changing it at the last moment to create as much impact as possible. And you can check out the Indiana Jones theme to see what I mean. Anyway, verse 1A is just those 2 chords, B-flat major and G-flat major. And it's 8 bars long. Now we continue into verse 1B. And he starts with B-flat major again, but then he switches to B-flat minor. Spooky. Going from major to minor is a little bit ear-bending, but it's not all that unusual of a trick. 2 other examples of this are Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Strauss, which you might know as the theme from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And you can also hear it happening in the chorus of Faith No More's Midlife Crisis, which is E major, D major, A major, and then E minor, because the second time around they switched to E minor to accommodate that Mike Patton vocal melody on the words, Me, You're Only. But back to Moonpeople. Here's a very common move. Let's say B-flat major is the 1 chord, which it is in this verse. But when we change it to a B-flat minor, you could think of that as the 2 minor chord in the key of A-flat major. Because what happens? Devin goes up to E-flat major, which is the 5 chord in A-flat major. And that works as a 2-5 progression. Starting from B-flat minor and moving up to E-flat major is a Dorian mode sound. And normally that would be setting up a 2-5-1 progression landing on A flat major. But what's not so common is it hangs on that E flat major for 3 bars. And the drum layers disappear, and we have this magical cloud of E flat major for those 3 bars. So that means that verse 1B is 7 bars long. And that's right, there's kind of a bar missing. And that's good because it creates some subconscious unpredictability. So even if a song is 4/4 all the way through, it can have an odd number of bars. Add a bar, subtract a bar, surprises the listener. And after that odd bit of cloudiness, it hits into the big release of the chorus. But it's a bit of a strange move, I think, for the chorus to start on F, a whole step up from the previous chord. But that's all right. I don't think it's the strongest move to make, but it works fine. Now let's zoom out and look at the big picture here. The verse is in B flat, and the chorus is in F. And if you were to reduce this whole song down, that is a big 1-5, which makes total sense in the world of tonal music. Okay, so we're in the chorus, and the progression goes F, C, E flat, B flat, all major chords. And in Roman numerals, that would be 1, 5, flat 7 major, and 4. It's a super common progression used by every punk rock kid because it's kind of a square on the guitar neck. No coincidence, Devin also used it when he was 14 years old as the basis of the first song on his Ancient Cassette compilation. So he's been working on this one for a while. And that goes for a total of 8 bars. Okay then, I will let everyone know. Then there's what you could call a post-chorus for 4 bars, which is 2 bars of B flat minor, 2 bars of B flat major. And notice here that he reverses the previous major to minor shift. And that B flat major has some overdubs that seem to give it a bit of a B flat Lydian sound. Then we get a 4-bar re-intro. And what we can call verse 2 is 10 bars long. What? But it's that B flat and G flat again. And after 8 bars of that, there are 2 more extra bars of magical Devin Townsend cloud. And at the end of that, Devin says, "Stop it." As if to say, stop getting all mysterious and get back into this nice pop song. Which he does. Chorus 2 is the F, C, E flat, B flat major chord progression, but it's a double chorus this time, and the orchestration is building up as he goes along. Then, from that last B flat major chord of the chorus, we get a sort of bridge with the heavy guitar, and we move to B flat minor, and then B flat major, and then B flat minor. And then it's another cloud of sound effects for 4 bars. And then we get a much heavier chorus 3 with F, C, E flat, and B flat. The second time through that heavier chorus, there's a very low blues melody. Under the F major chord, the heavy guitars play the notes A flat, E flat, E natural, and F. And those are the scale degrees flat 3, flat 7, 7, and 1. And at the same time, for that single measure, the drums deviate a little bit from the very straight beat of the rest of the song, which can be disorienting, but if you listen closely, it's still just plain old 4/4 at the same tempo. And at this point, Devin is going nuts with the vocal overdubs, which is something I always like to hear. And at the end of that chorus, instead of a B flat, there are 3 measures on a murky G flat sort of chord, which was used earlier in the verse, a major third away from the B flat. And hey, those were the 2 chords in the verse. All he did here was swap one out for the other. And that B flat chord lasts 4 bars, which extends chorus 3 out to a total of 18 bars. For a sort of outro, Devin goes around the little verse idea at the very end, and he's throwing in some heavy guitar notes over the B flat chord. And they sound like a D flat, which is a flat 3, a D natural, which is a 3rd, an F, which is a 5, and it slightly bends down to a flat 5, and then an A flat, which is a flat 7. And that outro is 8 bars, but it ends on beat 3 of the 8th bar. As far as the production, there is a slow and steady constant buildup of overdubs. It's pretty interesting to listen to one of the later verses and then immediately listen to verse 1A. You can hear just how much the song had been built up with all those layers. It is effective pop music production. Overall, this was a fun song to take apart, and honestly, when I first heard it, I wondered what the heck he was doing. And after figuring it out, I realized, oh, he's doing the stuff that both of us do all the time. Mystery solved. So I recommend that whenever you hear something in a piece of music you like, but you don't yet understand, take the time to figure it out, because it can become a musical tool to use in your own music later. Just remember to steal from as many places as possible so it's not obvious where you're getting all your ideas. Anyway, Devin has something like 30 albums, and he actually puts out so many albums I can't keep up. I think he tends to release like 3 or 4 of them at a time, and they range from acoustic to spooky country to electronic to extreme metal. And I haven't listened to any more of the songs on this latest album, Lightwork, yet, but I'm guessing it's kind of good. To find out more about Devin Townsend, just type his name on the internet, I guess. And now for this week's film examination of a film. This week we will examine The Dark Crystal from 1982. Mike Stone requested this one, but coincidentally, I think this is one of Devin Townsend's favorite movies, and it sure does make a nice pairing with his song Moonpeople. Now, this film was directed by 2 directors, Jim Henson and Frank Oz. Turns out both of them did some previous puppeteering work on a late-night show called The Land of Gorch. Huh. I also discovered that The Dark Crystal was executive produced by David Laser, which is such a crazy 80s name I had to look it up to see if it was real. And it was, I think. And this film was screenwrited by David Odell, who went on to write the Masters of the Universe movie in 1987. But I'm sure you knew that. Now, the film starts out with narration, which works for a mythical fairy tale. But it goes on for 3 minutes and starts to feel like an episode of National Geographic. And I wonder, was it originally conceived to play without all of that exposition? Folks, I'm always interested in the specific timing of opening scenes. Like, how long until we first hear dialogue, and how long until the main character appears? Well, a minute goes by, and the narration starts back up again, with the people and places and things, and people and places and things. Speaking of people, places, and things, I wonder if this movie contains the most elaborate puppeteering ever. And not only that, the sets are epic. I can't imagine how much effort must have gone into building them, and I never even realized puppets could build sets. Anyway, at 7 minutes in, the main character, Jen, speaks for the first time, and I noticed in some scenes Jen's mouth doesn't move. So maybe that specific dialogue wasn't originally intended, or it's supposed to be his thoughts, or is he controlling another puppet somewhere? We don't know yet. But the scene with Jen and his master dying sure does remind me of Return of the Jedi, when Yoda is dying in his little hut on Dagobah. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen either of those movies yet. Anyway, in that dying master scene, the plot gets locked in because he tells Jen, quote, You need to go get a thing from a person and do something with it at the end of the movie, unquote. Well, that's not word for word what he says, but what we have here is basically a video game mission, which is maybe not so much a story as it is an errand. Now, if we consider Jen the protagonist, he sure is kind of helpless, because his companion Kira always saves the day. She has all the skills. She speaks animal languages, and she uses weapons. She knows medicine, and can even fly. And Jen spends most of his time in the movie lost, not knowing what to do. Falling out of windows, rolling down hills, getting stuck in the mud, and even dropping things. He's kind of a Jar Jar Binks. I'm trying to remember if he does anything of consequence until the very last moment. So I'm not sure why Jen was actually the chosen one. If Kira had taken the shard, she could have gotten the mission completed in 10 minutes, and the movie would be over. Maybe the filmmakers expect us to more easily identify with incompetent and confused characters. Like, yeah, that idiot is just like me up there on the screen. Now, regarding the spiritual philosophy behind this film, there's the idea of duality. An ideal race of perfect beings seemingly made out of light, called the Skeksis, has been split up into the Urus, also called the Mystics, and the Skeksis. What's wrong with being Skeksis? By the way, Devin Townsend's band Strapping Young Lad had a song called Skeksis, and I don't see any connection between the song and the film, but I will put a link to it in the show notes. Now, the Mystics are egalitarian hippies. They're peaceful and gentle, and they have no leader, but the Skeksis are all fighting each other for power. And I think what the filmmakers were suggesting was, we need balance between the two sides so we can be in harmony or something. But what was wrong with the Mystics? They seem to be doing just fine, chanting and making symbols out of sand. That's pretty much an ideal life. So why not just keep the good guys and get rid of the Skeksis? If the good guys are entirely good and the bad guys are entirely bad, what's the point of having a balance between them? I say just get rid of the bad. It all reminds me a little bit of Rush's Hemispheres, but at least in the case of Hemispheres, each civilization or phase of civilization suffered consequences by being too rational or being too emotional. So yeah, I don't think we needed to have a grand conjunction or whatever it was called. Now, like a lot of people in my generation, I was a kid when this movie came out, and I loved it. But looking back, I have to wonder, number one, how much of our enjoyment of this movie is simply nostalgia? Since enjoying a movie about puppets is a life or death situation, I think we should question our motives here. Do we think this thing is good just because we watched it when we were kids? And maybe anything we see as kids, we grow up to think it's awesome. It's like movies and music imprint themselves on us. And as we get older, maybe it becomes harder for an imprint to be made. And is that because of neuroplasticity? We don't know yet. And number two, if this story weren't specifically executed as puppets, would we even care about it? Is the actual story any good? Or do we only care about the decoration? Like if it were live action or a fiction novel, would we be as excited? I don't think we would. But in my own subjective opinion, cinematography doesn't get better than the cinematography in The Dark Crystal. Whatever film stock and lenses this was shot on, we shouldn't have used anything else. Can we just go back? I noticed it has a similar look to Flash Gordon and Empire Strikes Back. In fact, a lot of camera angles and lighting reminded me specifically of Empire Strikes Back. Wait a minute, could this puppet film have inspired Empire Strikes Back? Well, no, because Empire Strikes Back was actually from 1980, 2 years earlier. I was under the impression that Empire was later on, maybe in 1982. Okay then, I will let everyone know. One last note on the puppeteering. At 1 hour, 24 minutes in, Aughra, my favorite character, and Fizzgig, the little fur ball, are moving through a passage. And I think there's an unbelievably fast switcheroo between two different versions of Fizzgig. You can see Fizzgig number 1 moving along down the corridor, I suspect being pulled by a string, and then he moves behind a rock. And instantly, I think Fizzgig number 2 pops up and barks, which would mean that there was a hand inside it. And in one quick motion, Fizzgig number 2 ducks back behind the rock, just in time for Fizzgig number 1 to move around the rock and keep moving down the corridor. At least, I think that's how they did it. And I'm sure the movie is full of tricks like that. And if that's not how they did it, I have no idea how. Now, let's talk about the music for The Dark Crystal. It was scored by Trevor Jones. And in my own subjective opinion, it was a good movie score, but not as unusual and otherworldly as I would have expected. I would think a fantasy realm inhabited by magical creatures might have their own unique systems of music theory. But this was a pretty straight-up traditional orchestral score, and by coincidence, I discovered the following. According to Wikipedia, quote, Trevor Jones initially wanted to compose a score which reflected the setting's oddness by using acoustical instruments, electronics, and building structures. But it was felt that an unusual score would alienate audiences, unquote. I don't know what they meant by building structures, but I can't help but wonder what that alternate score might have sounded like. Maybe we were all cheated out of a work of 20th century compositional madness on par with Goldsmith's Planet of the Apes. And related to this alienation of audiences, in a behind the scenes, it was explained that a lot of the characters originally spoke in made-up alien languages. But the screenings for test audiences were, quote, a disaster. The filmmakers expected audiences would still understand the story, but they left the theater totally confused. So Henson and Oz went back in and re-recorded a ton of the character dialogue in English. And they had to sync it up with the puppets' mouth movements, which had already been filmed. But you know what? I say let's go back and restore it to its full alienness, because we have enough movies that don't alienate audiences. I think true fans of The Dark Crystal would probably go crazy over it. In the meantime, I'm giving this film 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd, and I'm willing to give it a little heart if and when we get those alien languages and alien music put back in. Okay, that's the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. And support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. And as always, special thanks to my $51 a month patrons at the Special Illusionist level, Chubode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, okay then, I will let everyone know.